All right, so last time I was a little distracted by the line of the projector on the left there, and I was trying to think what I was forgetting. I remember, but it actually fits pretty well with the beginning kind of topic, or transitioning to this new section here. Let me just move this mouse out of the way. So the last thing we talked about was Pareto ranking of techniques and the different methods in Pareto ranking MOGA algorithms to encourage movement toward the Pareto frontier and distribute across it. Let me turn on a couple more lights here in the front. All right, that's maybe a little better. Okay, so now I just want to make some clarifications, which I think will help also in the concept check for the multi-objective optimization. So I'm going to define, this is my term, a dominion or a dominating, I'll call it a dominion cone or a dominating cone. Yeah, we'll call it a dominating cone. And that's my term. And it's just meant to help you when you're looking at these multi-objective optimization functions, or looking at this criteria space, figuring out which solutions are dominating which others visually. And so what I kind of define as the dominating cone is if I were to draw optimization objectives, let's say I'll draw two of them, but this generalizes to any number. And let's say in this case, it's better to be greater in both. But in other cases, you might imagine that in some cases, it will be better to be less in both, less in one, and better in another, or greater in another, or the flip case, where I might say it's better in F2 to be greater. This is the better direction, and it is better in F1 to be less. And then finally, maybe it's better in both to be less. So if I wanted to figure out which solutions dominate which others, then what I will often do is draw what I'm calling here a dominating cone. And what I mean by that is it is if I draw a solution anywhere, let's say I'll draw the solution here, and I'll try to draw the solution roughly there on each one of these. Well, maybe not. Maybe I'll, just to give myself more room, I'm gonna move that a little bit more centrally. So I'll draw a candidate solution somewhere mid here. And if I want to figure out what other solutions dominate this solution, and remember, Pareto dominance means better in all optimization criteria, then what I do is I draw a cone whose sides are pointed in the direction of in the good direction in each one of the optimization objectives. So for this top corner, I might draw a cone that has sides that go like this. In this, and I drew them in this direction because I know that in the F2 dimension, that's the better direction. In the F1 direction, that's the better direction. And by drawing that cone, then that tells me that if there was a solution, say here, then this solution would dominate my focal solution. So my focal solution is the purple one right here. And if there is another solution out here, that solution is better in both dimensions, so it dominates this one. Now, if the optimization criteria are such that it's not necessarily best to be greater in both, then I have to kind of redraw this cone, and it's going to change. So here, we're going to imagine that the Pareto frontier is going to be, maybe I'll use the highlight here, the Pareto frontier is probably going to be out here. So this up here is this right up here is our frontier, Pareto frontier. But in these other cases, like in this second one here, then I look at this and I say, well, it's better to be lower in F2, and it is better to be greater in F1. So that tells me that any solution to the right of F1, but lower in F2, is going to be a dominating solution. So, I'm going to draw this line this way and this way, which indicates to me that this here is the dominating area. So any solution here is better in F2 because it's better to be lower in F2, and better in F1 because it's better to be greater in F1. So this solution dominates the focal solution. And from here, I would probably expect the Pareto frontier to be along this edge. And then I can do the same game down here. So down here, I know that it's better to be greater in F2 and less in F1. So I can say, well, I want to know that since it's better to be greater in F2 and less in F1, I draw that, maybe I meant to draw that the other way. No, I got that right the first time, sorry. So greater in F2 and less than F1. So that means that I draw my cone in this upper corner, and this solution would dominate that solution. And my Pareto frontier would be along this edge. And then finally, in the kind of mutual minimization case, and I see the question, I'll just, let me just finish this off. So in this case, if it's better to be lower in both, then I'll draw the cone down here where this solution dominates this solution. And we would expect the Pareto frontier to be kind of along this axis, to be down there. So we've got the Pareto frontier in the upper right, in the lower right, in the lower left, and the upper left for these two objective cases. But like I said, this would generalize to any number of objectives. So this helps us figure out where the dominating solutions are. So in, I think the concept check, and then certainly in like the final exam, if I gave you questions about these sorts of things, then I might give you some cases where I've got it where they're both, it's better to be in the same direction for both. But in other cases, I might mix them up. So sometimes you might be, mutually minimizing. Sometimes you might be doing a combination of these two. So we mentioned the knapsack problem. So in the knapsack problem, it's better to be smaller in weight, but larger in profit. So smaller in weight, it would be like here, and larger in profit would be like here. So if we were mapping profit on one axis, on weight on another axis, then we would be looking for knapsack solutions that were in the lower right. Okay. Was there a question?
My first question was, when you say non-dominated set, would that be points on the frontier itself?
Okay, good question. So the question was about the term non-dominated set or non-dominated solution. So the Pareto frontier is the limit of, but we'll say the Pareto frontier is the union of all so-called non-dominated solutions. And so those are solutions that there are no other solutions that dominate them, and that's what makes them Pareto. A dominated solution is one that is not going to be on the frontier. Within any group of candidate solutions, like in a generation of a MOGA, we might have solutions that for that generation are non-dominated. So there has not been a solution so far that has dominated them. So they're kind of like our best estimate of the Pareto frontier so far. But in the next generation, we might find one that dominates them, and then they'll get kicked out. So.
Iteration or generation, the Pareto frontier is the non-dominated one.
We would say the non-dominated set at every generation is our current best estimate of the Pareto frontier, of samples from the Pareto frontier. Yeah. And I think I saw a question pop up online, or maybe that just Zoom just decided to, okay. Any other questions about this? Is it clear what I mean by better and how you can have differences in direction? Okay, so once we have this in mind, so we know how to look for these things. I mentioned that now in MOGA and all of the descendants of MOGA, like the very popular NSGA2 algorithm and now NSGA3, they use as a fitness concept this idea of Pareto ranking. And so I mentioned before that the general idea of Pareto ranking, it's a ranked fitness approach where we are ranking solutions by how dominating, I'm just going to put this in quotes for a second, they are. Now, there are multiple ways that we can come up with a ranking, and there are reasons why we might choose one over another. And this is something I didn't talk about in detail last time, but I meant to. So, the basic, so we're talking about, well, approach one is to simply count up how many others each solution dominates. So we count the number of solutions. I'll just phrase it the way I said it. Count how many solutions are dominated by. So how many solutions, how many others they dominate. That's the way I've written it down. I'm just going to stick with that. How many others they dominate. And so the idea here is if I were to draw, say, this frontier here, which I'll try to reuse. So I'll call this F1, this F2. Let's say it's better to be higher in both of these. And I'm going to set up a simple example with 4 candidate solutions, one pretty close to the origin. And I'm going to draw its little dominating cone this way. And so everybody up here dominates that poor little solution. And then I will draw another one, say, here. Another one roughly here. And then another one, I'm going to draw 5 solutions actually, total here. And so note that none of these 3 dominate each other. So by themselves, they would be in the non-dominated set of these 4. But I could then say, well, what if there's a 5th solution that's way up here? Now that 5th solution dominates all of the rest of them. It's in the dominating set for all of them. Okay, so how do we assign rankings to these things? So there are 3 ways that we can do that. So I am going to copy this because I'm just going to reuse this example over and over. So in your notes, if you prefer, you can just keep annotating on top of this one. So maybe I'll just move this down too. All right, so in approach one, what we would do is we would assign, we count how many others each one of them dominates. And so for this one up here, we might give it a rank of 4, because there are 4 that it dominates. And then down here, we would then give all of these a rank of 1. And then this one here, we might give it a rank of 0. Now note that in these Pareto ranking approaches, it's common to add 1 to the rank when you actually calculate the fitness, just so you don't have any 0 fitness solutions. So, so I'll just maybe make a note. Add 1 to rank to get fitness. And that way we don't have a rank 0. Okay, so does anyone see a potential problem with this choice of ranking? Or in other words, this choice of fitness assignment? I'll see online too if there's any suggestions.
Like you have basically the one that, like, let's say it's ranked 4, but it's not that much better. The one so you might like at the end of the day filter like by the highest rank, and like one of them beats all the other ones, but it may not be much better, because if you like look at it on the graph or something, it might not be much like slower than the other.
All right, so the answer, or the comment here was that that perhaps you could have one solution that would have a very high rank, but maybe actually wasn't that much better than a lot of the other solutions. And that's kind of what I'm getting here, is that right now, if we used, if you remember how to do rank selection in a standard GA, then it's basically like fitness proportionate selection, but using the ranks for your proportionality. And because this rank, especially once it's 1 has been added to it, this rank is so much higher than this rank. And so I guess I could point out here, there's a large gap that if we did a selection action on this, we would be very likely to promote solutions here. And even though these 3 solutions are very diverse in terms of their width coming up towards the frontier, they all are much lower in rank than this one. And so they don't have a good shot at making it into the next generation. In other words, there's too much. This is very high selective pressure. So remember, selective pressure is basically the rate at which high fitness solutions flush out even slightly lower fitness solutions. So when I look at this, I ideally would like to, I definitely want to keep this solution, but these solutions from a Pareto perspective, although they are all dominated by this one, if I think about if I were to move each one of them up, then they would fill out the Pareto frontier a little bit better than just this one solution. But if I go just based on these ranks, then I risk clustering everybody around this solution and then just hoping to get diversity back out. But right now, we haven't really talked about any way to generate much more diversity except for basic mutation. So so right now, you know, we're getting rid of too much diversity there. In other words, we have too high selective pressure. So this is a natural way to think about ranking solutions in a Pareto sense, but it has this downside, it's really too high selective pressure. So we would like to maybe come up with a different way of ranking. So I see some comments online. So for example, yeah, these are excellent comments online. So someone says, should the rank be reversed? And that's an interesting comment. And so hold that thought for our next, for what we're about to get to here. Then someone else says, probably just want ranks to be 1 apart. So ideally you would have, this one would be rank 4 maybe, this would be rank 3, or maybe this would be rank 1, this is rank 2, this is rank 3. And that might be the ideal case. But then we have to think, well, how do we build an algorithm that's going to get them one apart? And again, hold that thought because we're going to get into that. And then someone else mentioned 3 of them in the same rank. I'm actually okay with these 3 sharing this rank because from a Pareto perspective, these 3 are equivalent to me. They're just trading off these 2 objectives differently. So I'd actually like, because having them all the same rank in theory maintains diversity. The problem is when you go from one rank to another, you end up destroying 3 just to get 1, which we don't like. So we want to come up with other ways to rank. And so this is like the most kind of like straightforward way to think about ranking, but it is not necessarily the most commonly used when we're thinking about ranking in the Pareto sense in these algorithms. So let's think about another approach. So I'm going to flip to the next page. And so this is approach 2. And here, let's rank by how many dominate that solution. So the idea here, let's see if I can manage to paste that back so I can have the same example. Technology. All right, so in approach 2 here, same exact layout here, but I'm going to assign rankings differently. And so the way I'll assign rankings is instead of saying how many does each solution dominate, I kind of look up from a solution and say how many solutions dominate you. And so, and again, I might add 1 to get the fitness out of this. And so for here, then I can say, well, this one here is rank 0. And then all 3 of these are rank 1. And then this loser back here is rank 4. And then again, add 1 to get fitness. Okay, so this is a little bit better because now there is less of a gap between good, whatever that means, solutions. And so there is less selective pressure, at least at the top, near frontier, at least generally for these types of settings. Yeah.
But if you know also for this case or even the previous case when you're doing rank 0, that's the bottom one, but if you like when you actually do the selecting, you select like the top 3 ranks, the top 4 ranks. So it doesn't matter how big the gap is, like before that was rank whatever and up there was rank 4.
So the question here is, which is an excellent question, and we will get to exactly this. So the suggestion was in this example or in the previous example, you could imagine maybe re-ranking after all the ranking is done. So I could say that in the past, in the previous one, I'm going to temporarily swipe back. Over here, I had rank 4, rank 1, and rank 0. Well, now that I've ranked them all, I could then re-rank them 1, 2, and 3. Likewise, over here, I've got 0, 1, and 4. Now that all the ranking's done, I could re-rank them 0, 1, and 3. Or sorry, well, maybe that 0, 1, and 2. So I definitely could re-rank them, and that would compress these things. And that is referred to as fitness scaling. And we will get to that as our kind of like ultimate tool in our toolbox to control selective pressure. So that's good insight that that's coming, but I don't want to get there just yet. All right, but I saw another thing pop up there. Any other questions? So this solution makes sense. We just kind of flipped how we're doing the counting. All right, so the third approach that is commonly used is hard for me to say in one line, so I'm going to break it up into 2 steps. And so the idea here is I'm going to iterate through, so step 1, iterate through rounds of removing the non-dominated solutions, NDS, non-dominated solutions, and then rank by round of removal. So in this case, if I were to go back, I'll paste that example back here, same example as before. And so now I look through this first and I say there is initially, this is the only non-dominated solution. So I'm going to remove it and replace it with rank 1 because it was removed in the first round. After it's removed, the remaining 3 here are the non-dominated solutions. And so they will be removed in round 2. So they get rank 2. And then after all of those are removed, then finally this poor one down here gets its shot at being a non-dominated solution. And so it will get removed in the final round and it gets rank 3. And so this approach gives us this ordering where we're never going to skip ranks, right? So it allows us to get these nice striations, these nice layers here. So, so here we have no skipped ranks. And you could then say, basically, we have kind of the lowest selective pressure. Because it naturally compresses things down so that the number of solutions that dominate them doesn't drive everything. All right, so now when you look through these, I hope the computer scientists in the room try to consider the computational complexity of each one of these tasks and how maybe building certain types of data structures could simplify these calculations. Because again, Pareto optimization is non-trivial computationally. There are a lot of pairwise comparisons. And again, you can imagine building data structures that keep track of these things so that as you add in new solutions, then maybe you don't have to update a bunch of ranks. And so your choice of ranking method may be tied to the optimizations you've made in calculating ranks. So, so ultimately, you might not get much of a choice as to which one of these 3 you want to use. And so then you need another tool to kind of adjust the fitnesses afterwards. And that's this kind of idea of fitness scaling. So that's our kind of last thing that I want to add on to this. I think I see a question here. Yeah, why not approach 1 and go through and give the lowest rank 1, so on and so forth. I think the comment that was just left in the chat is describing this approach here, where we're just saying we're grabbing 1, getting rid of it, seeing who's left over, grabbing them, getting rid of them, and so on and so forth. So that's this kind of iterative approach here. So regardless of which approach you use, you've got a rank-based fitness afterwards, and you might want to do additional adjustments. And that fits into the area of fitness scaling. So, so then we put maybe a different color. And in fitness scaling, what we do is adjust rank-based fitnesses with either linear or nonlinear mapping. So the idea here is you could you could basically say I've got my rank-based fitness here, and I've got the fitness I want here. And you could imagine a bunch of different ways to rescale your fitness. And so, you might say that I want something that looks like this. Maybe I want something that looks like this. Maybe I just want a straight line, but I want to adjust the slope, and so on. So you can take these integer fitnesses that come out, and you can turn them in to a wider spread of fitnesses that maybe better reflect the type of selective pressure that you want. And so that way you can amplify, differences between some ranks, and you can attenuate differences between other ranks. Okay. So that's kind of the tools in the toolbox of Pareto-based approaches here. So before I look up, I just want to make sure I'm on the right page here. Okay. Yes.
So in the suggested approaches, like do we like to find the actual algorithm? Do we actually take the utility list, which is the solution is better than the other one? Like when it's plotting on the ground.
These, none of these.
Like the solution dominates
computation. So the question was, how do we say one solution dominates another one computationally? And that goes back to this dominating cone idea that for every solution that you're considering, the whole population, 100 solutions, you can go to each solution, and then you can ask for every other solution, all other 99 of them. So this is one of those 99. How does it compare in each of the optimization criteria? That's right. So a little comparator there. And so you can say, go ahead.
So the final approach, when you are removing those solutions according to like how they are dominating, so you checking for each point how many points are better than that case, like X1 over the next.
That's right. So you could imagine, geometrically, you could imagine for each one of those, you draw their dominating cone and ask, is anyone in it? And if no one is in it of all the other solutions, then it is a non-dominated solution, and it can be removed in this round. And then you redraw these, and so every time you find one who has no one in their dominating cone, then you mark it as an NDS, and you leave them all in there until you're completely done marking everyone. And then once you find all of the NDSs, you remove them and then repeat. Well, I mean, there's a bunch of different ways that you can organize it, but you could, I think, if you go back to thinking about, fundamental data structures, I mean, you're sort of establishing a topology on these points, who's next to each other, who's above each other, and those sorts of things. And so you could imagine that this ranking, every time you add a point, you could imagine, and again, there's a bunch of different tree-based structures that could do this, where you have to sort of decide where to add inside the data structure, and then the data structure will keep track of who's ranked where. Okay. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, is there any way like you can find out that how many points you have put on the same rank? For example, these 2 points of the same rank. So yeah, how could we do it with that, like?
Well, so what do you mean by how do we figure out how many are the same? How do you plot them together? Club them? Oh, well, I mean, so like this algorithm here will naturally do it. It will assign all of them rank 2, because you'll iterate through, you'll get rid of this one. And then when you go down to these, you'll look, before you remove any, you'll mark this one as non-dominated. This one is non-dominated, this one is non-dominated, this one is dominated. And then after that round, you'll remove all the ones that got marked as non-dominated. And because you remove them all in the same round, they'll all get the same rank. Okay. Any other questions about these approaches? These are just 3 different approaches that you'll see across different Pareto optimization algorithms, Pareto optimal algorithms. They have strengths and weaknesses about simplicity of implementation, but ultimately you can cope with some of the selective pressure issues with fitness scaling afterwards. And that's why generally in every one of these Pareto optimal algorithms, you do have a round of fitness scaling that goes on afterwards to allow you, the optimizer, to go through and adjust these things. And so typically this is a hyperparameter that you as an optimizer can go into someone else's algorithm and adjust this thing to say, I think you're getting to the frontier way too fast, and you're getting rid of diversity for this particular set of optimization criteria. So I am going to put in a fitness scaling algorithm, maybe like this one, that is going to decrease the higher ranks differences between them, so that lower ranks are maybe removed, but the higher ranks stay in the population for longer, and maybe they'll help maintain diversity for longer. Okay, so that's fitness scaling. And then that finally brings us into kind of the true intro to our next unit. And so I mentioned before that once you've come up with, this is how we've managed selective pressure in the multi-objective genetic algorithm or in multi-objective evolutionary algorithms. This is how we maintain movement toward the frontier, hopefully not reducing diversity that was already there. But we didn't talk about how to generate new diversity, and we not yet in this class, but last class, we talked a little bit about methods for doing that. So I mentioned that, so I should say that, you know, this will hopefully maintain diversity while moving toward frontier. That is the goal of this so far, was to move toward the frontier and hopefully not collapse things to a point as you're doing that. We're going to maintain a community of solutions as we move the whole community toward the frontier. But then the next challenge is then how do we further diversify so that once we hit that frontier, we can start spreading along the frontier. And so those mechanisms are what I referred to earlier under the umbrella of fitness sharing. And so there are a bunch of different ways we can do fitness sharing. So you can, let's say, count your number of neighbors of each solution. And this could be either in decision space or niche or criteria space. Or I'll say niche / criteria space. And so there are a bunch of different ways you could do this, but the basic idea is you define a region of where solutions are sufficiently close to be practically equivalent. And so basically you could say, for example, in my criteria space, if you're within 1 volt of, you know, whatever my voltage measurement that I'm optimizing in an F1 is, and if you're within half a meter of whatever my length measurement is in F2, then that defines kind of a box where any solutions within that box together are so close in my 2 criteria that there's really no reason to keep 2 of them. Just 1 is fine enough. And I would rather take that extra 1 and spread it out along the frontier in some way there. So a way to do that then is to divide each individual fitness by this, what I'm going to call niche count. And so, and this is actually a term a term of use in the industry too, niche count. So, so this is basically defining a niche, and then each individual. So we have individual has a fitness 1, fitness 2, etc. And they're all within the niche. And so after this, they'll all have fitness 1 divided by the niche count, fitness 2 divided by the niche count, and so on. And so that means that if they are a very similar fitness, where fitness here is their Pareto rank, then it will be very likely that one of them is going to make it in the next generation, but not both. And that helps us keep things diverse. That's one of the things that helps us keep things diverse. The other approach that I didn't talk about last time is called clearing, and I think I mentioned it briefly, but I didn't name it. And so the clearing approach is even simpler than that, where you basically define, you look into one of these little defined niches, and you just remove a number of individuals from each niche and then replace them with random individuals located elsewhere in the space. So this is just remove individuals randomly from overpopulated niches and create new individuals elsewhere in population. So we have fitness sharing and niche clearing. Two approaches that you can see occur in many multi-objective algorithms, and then also some of the algorithms that we're about to talk about as we transition into this next unit. All right, so these hopefully we'll say improve diversity along frontier. All right, any questions about that? I'm going to question. So the question is, which individuals get targeted for removal? And the idea is, if you've defined a niche, you're saying that within that niche, we're calling all individuals there effectively the same.
Yeah,
and so
yeah, I meant that. So when so we select random and then you're replacing them. Now when you're replacing with the new individual, will that be somewhere else or just random?
Generally, it's going to be just random, because if we kind of knew how to place that individual, then we would kind of probably not need the optimization algorithm. And so the best thing we can do, there might be in your tool for introducing these new ones, you might have some heuristic built in so that you hopefully don't create a really terrible individual that's bad and that is just going to be wiped out. But and we'll talk a little bit about more specific ways how to create these individuals, especially as we move on into multimodal optimization. But basically, for all intents and purposes, it's just creating a random individual and allowing them to compete. Sort of a wild card individual. Any other questions? Let me make sure that nobody's popped up. Okay, so I hope I've communicated that in trying to come up with multi-objective optimization algorithms that establish communities of effectively equivalent but diverse solutions, people learned a lot about the evolutionary algorithm. and maintaining diversity and the value of diversity and so on and so forth. And it has trickled down into rethinking the single objective optimization algorithm. And so that is kind of where we're heading. Now, some of you have mentioned before, either in Muddiest Points or in class, like how might the multi-objective algorithms be parallelized across many processors? And that actually is related to this story too. So let's transition here. Back to one objective. All right, so let's start this story thinking about parallel processing. And so the idea here is that I've got 1,000 individuals and say 10 processors. And I'd like to speed up my genetic algorithm. Now, a natural way to do that is to just take my 1,000 individuals and say, I'm gonna run, effectively little 10 individual or 100 individual groups across my 10 processors. So each processor basically runs a little bit of a genetic algorithm, so you can imagine that, the downside of 1,000 individuals is every round of the genetic algorithm, you've got to execute 1,000 of this potentially costly optimization objective. Like, let's say your optimization objective required you to run a simulation that took 20 minutes to run. So then 1,000 individuals is like 1,000 individuals times 20 minutes. And so that's a lot. But if I have parallel processing, then maybe I could put 100 individuals on each individual processor. So I still, on each individual processor, I got to run 100 iterations of 20-minute simulations, but I at least am running them in parallel. So it's a natural way to parallelize these things. But it also introduces metapopulation dynamics. And so what we're getting into now are so-called island models. So imagine so this is what I'm going to refer to here as the distributed genetic algorithm. And this will get back to the whole diversity thing, all this, it'll end up tying back to multi-objective here after a short bit. So distributed genetic algorithms, or DGA. So this was, again, created to try to do, so we could imagine doing GA in parallel a number of different ways. The simplest ways would be to just simply have your GA running on a single processor, and whenever you wanted to execute a new evaluation of your optimization objective, you just dispatch it to other processors. So if you've got 64 processors, then whenever you have an individual that needs to be evaluated, it just gets dispatched, it returns its value back to the home GA, and so on and so forth. And so that's kind of a simple sort of primary, secondary way to distribute these GAs. Now, people started experimenting with alternative architectures, and that's where this distributed GA came from. And so the distributed GA, the idea here is that we form subpopulations or what are sometimes called demes, that are distributed across these processors. And so these are closely related. So we have one giant population divided by the number of processors, and then each one of those forms one of these subpopulations. And so a deme, so this actually borrows from biology, are closely related individuals typically breeding within the same group. So closely related individuals typically breeding within the group. So basically what DGA is establishing is that it's going to create these independent genetic algorithms that are going to run in parallel with small population sizes that will periodically exchange individuals. And so that's how they get coupled together, but they can kind of run freely in parallel with each other and only migrate periodically. So it's a little bit like Vega, that vector-enabled genetic algorithm that had the shuffling process where individuals were evaluated for one objective and then maybe shuffled into a new area where they were evaluated under another objective. But in this case, it's all one objective across all the processors. So, so I'll just write that down. So each processor runs a simple GA with same objective. Okay, and periodically, some individuals migrate between processors. Or between these demes. And so you could imagine, for example, elites from one population replace low fitness individuals from another. All right, so that's basically the architecture of the DGA. It's running in parallel with occasional migration there. Now, when people started, and I guess I should maybe put this phrase here. So this is a metapopulation, which means it's a population of populations. And at least in biology, metapopulations change the dynamics of how things evolve. And that actually is what happened here. So initially I don't actually know, when the first people that came up with a distributed GA, I don't actually think they expected this, but they were just saying, well, this is another way that we could distribute work across processors in a genetic algorithm. What they were surprised to find is that the distributed GA actually was outperforming regular GAs, even regular GAs that were parallelized. So it's not like by outperforming, I mean, they were actually finding higher fitness peaks. They were out exploring. They were doing a better job at finding optimal solutions, even for the same processing time. And so then the question became, well, what the heck is going on? Why is the distributed GA doing better than centralized GAs? And then we have to say, well, what happens in these small populations? And so in each one of these small populations, we have, so each subpop is smaller. And so what do we know about small populations in evolutionary systems? What are they more prone to? I thought I heard somebody say it. Let me look online to see if anybody said it. Drift, right. So each population is smaller, so it is more prone to drift. But we have multiple subpopulations, which means each subpop drifts to different, drifts to different solutions. So that's the crazy thing about it, is in the distributed GA, drift actually becomes an alternative source of variation. So you create subpopulations that each one of them is, has the same selective pressure, but because they're smaller, the selection doesn't quite get as much of a toehold as it could. So drift kind of takes over a little bit more. And you end up finding more of a tug towards random solutions. Now, if it is a single population, then you would just get, you might even get fixation to a single individual. And if you reran your GA, you get fixation to a different individual. And you reran your GA, fixation to a different individual. Well, here you've got these little micro experiments going on in parallel, where they're all kind of randomly, they're being tugged up fitness peaks, but they're also being tugged towards random directions by drift. And each one of them are being tugged in a different random direction from drift. And then they're exchanging. And that in itself seems to be what allows these distributed GAs to do a much better job exploring and exploiting than centralized GAs. So if we were to think about exploration and exploitation from a multi-criteria point of view, the distributed GA is a Pareto improvement on the non-GA because it actually can do exploration and exploitation simultaneously better. So this was a little bit of, I think, a surprise to the initial folks who were studying the distributed GA, but it turns out after further reflection, the biologists predicted this, not surprisingly. So there was an old population geneticist named Sewall Wright. So basically a mathematician who studies biology. And Sewall Wright had what's called shifting balance theory. And it turned out that shifting balance theory was a little too trivial or primitive or simplistic to really be useful in biology, in part because in biology, it is much easier to see signatures of exploitation than exploration. So it's really hard to see this process running. But it turns out the shifting balance theory was perfect to define what was going on inside these distributed GAs. And so what Sewall Wright was focused on was this idea of, let's say you have a large fitness landscape. So we're thinking biologically here. So imagine that this is sort of, these are your phenotype, or this is your genotype space. So we're saying these are different genotypes, and they map to different phenotypes, they map to different fitnesses. And so over here, we've got fitness. And so there, and I've kind of mapped everything to one dimension, but of course it's far more complicated than that. And there's these fitness peaks and valleys. And we'd ideally like to get to these really high ones here. But what Wright worried about was the so-called adaptive valley, as he realized that this adaptive valley down here was a real puzzle. Because if you were driven up a fitness peak, then how the heck are you going to get across this adaptive valley? Because there's no selection will not drive you that way. And mutation is probably not going to tunnel through that. Mutation is not strong enough to create these giant jumps where you can get from one peak to another. So these adaptive valleys seemed like a real big problem. And so what Wright suggested is, what if you had subpopulations that were distributed in demes that had periodic migration between them? And what Wright realizes, if you had subpopulations that were kind of all over the place, but small, then what you could have is you could still have selective pressure that's pushing things up the hill, but drift would end up kind of, would put a little bit of a muted, it would reduce the selective pressure so that you would get more diversity along the hill, and you might actually get others moving in the wrong direction. So you could actually get where you, even though you've got selection forcing things upwards, drift doesn't care what direction you're moving on an adaptive landscape. And so drift is willing to move in both directions. And so drift actually has the ability to enter the adaptive valley and possibly even find a nearby fitness peak. And once a solution has entered that nearby fitness peak, it's possible for selection to pull it up. And so if you were started on this fitness peak, you might drift into this fitness peak and then very quickly be able to be pulled up on top of it. And so this was sort of Wright's idea here of, if I was to summarize it, we have small population sizes makes drift strong. And when genetic drift is strong, we have more ability for the subpopulations to explore the genotypic space. They're going to stay close to their suboptimal peaks, but some may move into the adaptive valleys and actually survive and find their way up onto maybe adjacent adaptive peaks. Individuals in the valleys can sometimes be pulled up onto it, but then migrants can also move from one peak to another. And so you might have one peak might be approaching fixation, but then it might get migration from individuals who are on another peak. And that adds a new source of diversity, which shakes things up again. And then that higher peak then will end up effectively pulling the whole population onto that higher peak. So, like I said, it's these little micro experiments. In fact, I think that there's a really nice quote by Wade and Goodnight in a 1998 paper. I think I posted it. Small experiments in evolution. So that's what this idea behind shifting balance theory is, that these little demes are each tiny little experiments in evolution that compete with each other and share collaboratively to actually allow you to reach higher and higher fitness peaks over the whole global space. So shifting balance theory helped provide some theoretical explanation for why DGA was better at finding global optima. Because drift became a source of diversity, a novel source of diversity. And I think that's really cool, this idea that we talk about drift being so deleterious, but in the end, we end up being able to use drift if we use it in parallel as sort of a super mutation. So rather than cranking up our mutation rates, we can use migration and drift to give us the same effect of a cranked up mutation rate, but somehow a little less haphazard than just making things mutate a whole bunch and effectively doing a stochastic search. All right, so that's one example of how we're starting to see multi-populations kind of Vega-like potentially improve single optimization objectives. So are there any questions on this before I spend the last few minutes introducing the topic we'll spend a lot of time on next on Thursday? So shifting balance theory, distributed genetic algorithms, small populations drift more. The drift creates a new source of variation. They actually do a better job finding global optima. Okay, and let me make sure there's nothing online. So there's a question online, in terms of code, how do we introduce the drift? That's the beauty of drift, is you don't actually introduce drift, you just create smaller population sizes. And so we know that drift is just sort of a statistical certainty. It's a little bit like entropy always increasing or tending to increase. And so if you have 1,000 individuals, you can hold off drift a lot longer because the random sampling approach doesn't really create drift pressure. But if you have 100 or 10 individuals, then regardless of what the fitness is lined up to be, there's a high chance that you're going to just select some low fitness individuals randomly. So as you make populations smaller, you naturally crank up the drift. Drift isn't a parameter. If it was a parameter, it'd be population size. So, so that's, you get it for free by creating small population sizes. So there is a comment online, isn't this similar to evolution in plants? How farmers fortify different crops by mixing them with offsprings from different continents. And so that is a complex question. So there's a lot going on there when you're doing this kind of cross, when you're introducing these genes, you're introducing more gene flow there. I am not, so in some ways, yes, but in other ways, that's a little bit more directed. And this is a little bit more random. And so this is, you're not sort of selecting, plants that are good at certain things to introduce them into yours. Here, the migration is kind of totally random. And that's what allows you to explore the space so you can see, you create novel varieties that are better in ways that you didn't anticipate before. Okay. All right, so what I've been trying to motivate this whole time is that between MOGA and parallel genetic algorithms and distributed genetic algorithms, we know much more about diversity and selection pressure. We really have built up a knowledge of how these things shape evolutionary algorithms to an extent that they didn't really anticipate back when these things were first created. And so that allows us to rethink the whole problem and whether the single objective problem, if it's really good enough to just be looking for a single solution. And so rather than finding, so the idea here is rather than looking for a single global optimum, we can look out at our population of solutions that come out of our terminal genetic algorithm, and we can say, can't you do more? So right now, if your genetic algorithm gives me, it usually gives me a population, I pick the individual with the highest fitness, I say, that's my solution. The rest of the diversity in those solutions might be interesting, but it really is more of a diagnostic on the algorithm itself. Like, so if I see that I get one individual up top, a bunch clustered around it, some other elsewhere, then I say that shows me that the genetic algorithm was exploring pretty well, but I can't really use those other solutions in any useful way. It just kind of tells me about the process. So the question is, can I make the GA do more for me? Can I actually make those alternative solutions in the population give me something that might be useful for me? So rather than looking for a single global optimum, then we can ask, can we produce a population of solutions, or I'll say of optimizers, including the global optimizer and all local optimizers too. In other words, can I find a peak detector? So that's the new problem, is that can I use evolutionary algorithms? So right now I've already now we've gone through MOGA. We know that we can make populations which are interesting by themselves because they are distributed across niche space. So now I can ask myself, what is a niche when I only have a single optimization objective? In the past, I said a niche were equivalent solutions, and they were equivalent because they traded things off. You took a reduction in one optimization objective in order to take an increase in another optimization objective, and that formed a new niche. And so this community would show me different ways that I could trade these things off. Now, maybe for some reason, I am interested not just in the best solution, but alternative solutions that I know are pretty darn good, that maybe later I could look at some other criteria and choose among them. Or maybe I'm just interested in knowing about this optimization objective and how many peaks it has and so on and so forth. So there are a bunch of different applications where I might prefer not single objective optimization, but so-called multimodal optimization. Where I'm actually trying to find every mode of the single optimization objective here. And so what we're going to see as we move forward in this unit is that we are going to use mechanisms that preserve diversity and enhance it. So preserve and enhance diversity in single objective problems. And we have seen most of these mechanisms before, but we're going to see kind of embellishments of them to make them even stronger for these single objective cases here. So we're going to see fitness sharing. We are going to see clearing. We're going to see approaches for these that are based kind of on clustering analysis, as sort of was commented earlier before. So, so we are going to basically look for methods that create islands, create island subpops on local fitness peaks. And those themselves will become our new niches. And so now a niche is defined as a locally good solution. And so, so globally, if I look at the whole thing, it's inferior to a single global or maybe a couple of them in a really weird function global optima. But locally, it does better than all solutions within a neighborhood of it. And we're going to call that a niche. And we're going to say that you can imagine that if that individual could manage to find an island by itself, it wouldn't matter that there's an island somewhere else with an individual that could outperform it because they are spatially separated from each other. And so we're trying to find all such solutions that could be locally dominated. And that's what multimodal optimization does. So instead of getting a single optimization point or solution out and noise, which is what you normally get out of a GA, like you saw in your mini project one, these outputs, hopefully, if we do them well, every single point will be potentially a local optima. So every single point will be informative. Yeah.
So is that kind of like similar to a Nash equilibrium where you just take the partial derivative of your function with respect to each variable and find where each one maximizes itself, and you know that's where each x.
Well, so the question is, does this have relationships to Nash? Because I mentioned that a necessary condition for Nash equilibria is that the local utility function is 0 at that point. And they are distinct because in the Nash, we're talking about still multiple objectives. And so we're saying that in one genotype, there are certain genes which return benefits to one optimization objective and other genes that return benefits to another optimization objective. And a Nash kind of says where each objective is kind of satisfied simultaneously. So here we only have one optimization objective, you know, that single, you know, point here, and we're looking for all of these points on top of it. As,
Like a single optimization objective.
no, right, yeah. In order for I appreciate the enthusiasm for the Nash, but yeah, in order for us to really use the Nash usefully, we really have to have multiple objectives. All right. So any other questions? That's what we're going to pick up next time is multimodal optimization. And online, yeah, nothing new there. All right, well, I don't want to keep you guys any longer. Thanks for your patience as always. And